blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. Then he went and washed and came back, able to see. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some were saying, "It is he." Others were saying, "No, but it is someone like him." He kept saying, "I am the man." But they kept asking him, "Then how were your eyes opened?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' Then I went and washed and received my sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I do not know." They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight. He said to them, "He put mud on my eyes, then I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner perform such signs?" And they were divided. So they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him? It was your eyes he opened." He said, "He is a prophet." The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" His parents answered, "We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But we do not know how it is that now he sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, "He is of age. Ask him." So for the second time they called the man who had been blind, and they said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." He answered, "I do not know whether he is a sinner. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." They said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" Then they reviled him, saying, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from." The man answered, "Here is an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." They answered him, "You were born entirely in sins, and are you trying to teach us?" And they drove him out. Jesus heard that they had driven him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "And who is he, sir? Tell me, so that I may believe in him." Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he." He said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. Jesus said, "I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees near him heard this and said to him, "Surely we are not blind, are we?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would not have sinned. But now that you say, 'We see,' your sin remains." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ. May I speak to you in the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Good morning, dear friends.
Good morning.
It's good to see you. I don't know if you're aware of how readings work in the lectionary in our church, but in case you didn't know, the Sunday readings repeat on a 3-year cycle. We hear these readings every 3 years, and 3 years ago today, we were in the first Sunday of the pandemic, scattered as people all over the place, unable to see each other's faces, and yet worshiping the God who calls us together. The themes remain the same from year to year, and the collect remains the same every year, and sometimes it fits a little better with the readings than in others. Today we heard very little about bread, which is fine. We hear plenty about bread from John in other times of the year. But this is what we were reading 3 years ago. And if you have forgotten that we read this 3 years ago, you are forgiven. A few things happened in that time. This was the first weekend in the pandemic, and we had no idea what we were getting into, did we? Our lives would be changed forever. And I will refrain from a complete retrospective on how the pandemic has changed how we were gathered as church, but I think we'd be really missing the mark if we didn't honor at least some of those things, to just be a little curious about the difference between how we might have heard those readings then and how we hear them now. In preparation for this week, I couldn't help but reflect on just how little we knew and what we were getting in for when we posted notices on the door that for a couple of weeks we'd remain closed and we'd keep our distance from each other and we'd figure this thing out. We began live streaming for the first time. We were probably using my iPhone or something like it to try to find the connectivity in the church and trying to figure out how to go live on Facebook and all those clunky things. I remember the Saturday before running out to Charles Island and running into several people on the way from our parish. I ran into Mary Beth, her sister Carolyn, and so many other people who were kind of joyfully keeping their distance from each other, getting outside on a beautiful sunny day. The daffodils were starting to break in. It was an energizing, hopeful time. There was adrenaline, novelty, the challenge ahead of us. Those are some of my favorite food groups. I was in my element. In 2 weeks of this, I thought we'd be good. 3 years ago, our mission team to Juarez flew out west in typical fashion, crowded airports, grumbly TSA lines, and they flew back to eerily quiet airports, empty. Our children in school were suddenly home, parents suddenly became IT experts. Those of us caring for elder parents were also becoming IT experts, trying to figure out how we could stay in touch, especially for those in institutional settings like nursing homes or other places beyond our reach. We sanitized canned goods, remember that? Remember, did anyone bleach any grapes or anything? We might have bought a few extra rolls of toilet paper to say the least, just in case. And I could keep going. You have a sense of kind of where some of at least the kind of weird things were, but there was so much we didn't see coming. And yet there's so much that God has seen us through to get us to today. Jesus, our good shepherd, has walked with us, indeed through the valley of the shadow of death. We find ourselves here by God's grace, even though there was so much that we saw as we traveled through time these past 3 years. Our psalm says that we fear no evil as we travel through the valley of the shadow of death. I think that's aspirational. Life has been incredibly challenging in the time since that last lectionary cycle 3 years ago. Our eyes have been opened as we travel through that valley to some profoundly challenging realities. We live in a dangerously polarized political climate. We are exacerbated by our inability to gather together in person and be neighbors in the way that we know how to be human together. We couldn't be near each other. That didn't help us as we relied on social media platforms, just like the one we're live streaming on, which by their very algorithmic nature have a way of pulling us further and further and further and further out into polarized groups, separating us from what keeps us together in common, segregating us by all kinds of categories, radicalizing us even. Together we witnessed the killing of George Floyd. Together we were forced to reckon with the fractures and the structural injustices in the way that our Black and brown and indigenous and Asian siblings experience their daily life in this nation. Together and yet still apart, we had to grapple with doubts about the soundness of the institutions of our nation which we hold dear, whether that be church, whether that be law enforcement, whether that be public health, even our ability to remain a democracy. We lost loved ones. We lost time. We lost confidence. We lost patience. We may, for moments in time, have even lost hope. And yes, for some of us, perhaps even our faith. Yet somehow, by the grace and mercy of God, we've landed here, together, today. We can't go back 3 years to change what's happened, but we can walk forward together. With God's help and in the faith, we are continually being led by the one who leads us and calls us into new life. 3 years ago, we walked into the unexpected, but that keeps us in theme with today's readings, doesn't it? David was the last one who would have been picked in dodgeball in his school. He had taller, more handsome brothers who were first-round draft picks by Samuel, to be sure. And yet God reminds us that God doesn't see the way we do. God looks at the heart. Our Old Testament editors remind us also that David was no angel, and yet God worked through him anyway. David was the least likely candidate in a land and in a culture where primogeniture is everything. He was the last in line for the throne. And yet, this son of Bethlehem, this shepherd, is the one who would lead his nation and become a new king, foreshadowing another king from Bethlehem, Jesus himself. Our gospel story today brings us to this messy moment of healing where Jesus literally puts spit on the ground and rubs it in the dirt and literally smears mud on the eyes of a man born blind. As his eyes are opened to his new reality, his life is changed forever. And I love this messy story because it gives us permission to have messy stories ourselves. Not everything is as clean and clear-cut as we might edit it to be on those very radicalizing, polarizing social media platforms. Some people comment to me that they love to follow me on Facebook and Instagram. And I always reply, yes, and some of it's true. I don't know how many of you watch the Blues Brothers as much as I do. But Jake and Elwood are the brothers. And Jake has been in Joliet prison for a long time. And he just gets out. And the band has broken up. And Elwood hasn't told Jake about any of this. And Jake comes out and says, "You lied to me?" And Elwood said, "No, I just took the liberty of bullshitting you. It wasn't lies, it was just bullshit." It was just this way of kind of sheltering him from the hard realities. But Jesus doesn't do that. He gets into our truth. He gets into the down and dirty nature of our world. That's the nature of God incarnate in the first place. Jesus is God in the flesh, working with broken, messy people. This is yet another story from the down and dirty gospel, the story of Jesus. And on this Sabbath day, Jesus spits on the ground, mixes it with dirt, and makes clay. Now, if you are a good Jewish citizen, you know that this is a no-no. Because making clay on the Sabbath goes against the very nature of having a Sabbath in the first place. Because remember, Moses led God's people out of making clay for the bricks of the empire of Pharaoh. Right? People were forced into hard labor making monuments for a man who claimed to be God in Pharaoh. Under hard labor, the Hebrew people were sorely oppressed, fatally so. Their bones, their very lives ground up for building monuments. And so the law of Moses was a gift from God, shared with God's people in the wilderness, that people would forcibly have to take some rest, just like we had to forcibly take some rest 3 years ago. We had nothing to do for a couple of weeks, but just stay home and stay safe. Remember that saying? What a privilege that was for those of us who could do so. Not so much for our first responders, last responders, hospice chaplains. But the Sabbath rest, at its core, is a sacred release from forced labor. So seen through the eyes of culture at that time and from the very law of God, Jesus was breaking rules. The Pharisees, very mindful of the rules, were very upset by this. Looking back at that story of liberation, they were blind to who Jesus was in the present, but very aware of how what he was doing broke with tradition, broke with the law. But if we see Jesus, as we do now, looking back, as God himself, I invite us to imagine with me for a moment other times in which God was able to work with clay. When was another time in which God worked with clay? Genesis, absolutely. Did you ever see the Far Side cartoon where God is making the snake and he's rolling the clay in his hands? He's like, man, these things are a cinch. God working with clay, working with dirt, working with earth, the dust. Right? When we on Ash Wednesday begin this Lenten journey, we remember that we are dust, and to dust we shall return. God in the clay creates Adam, which is a Hebrew pun for Adamat, dust, dirt. Adam is created out of the earth. The first Adam is made by God, and God breathes life into him and calls him into new life. That Adam who was put in the garden to help be a steward of creation, a partner to Eve, someone in whom God delighted. And now Jesus, the second Adam, the one who comes to amend for the failings of the first, God in the flesh, in the person of Jesus, making clay is recreating once again. Jesus on the Sabbath is getting his hands dirty, creating new life for this man born blind who was asked for healing. A life where he no longer has to beg. He's free to live a new life, even if it is one that will be full of challenge and struggle. Make no doubt about it, this man born blind, by giving testimony to how he received his sight, paid a high cost. In that ancient extended family culture, he was driven out of his synagogue, his temple, his home. His parents, worried that they would be thrown out of their temple and home as well, threw him under the bus. They're like, he's of age, talk to him. We're not in charge of this guy. And sure enough, this man was driven out. He was given a new life, not necessarily an easy one. But this new life is something that we all experience. New life is not easy. I've mentioned the labor and delivery room before, and I'll mention it again. When new life comes into the world, we hear cries. Coming into a new life means that everything changes. It seldom comes without tears. In fact, tears are part of the process. Tears are what lubricate our eyelids and allow us to open our eyes to the new light. Without tears, we couldn't open our eyes. We couldn't see. Friends, we've arrived at this day having come through so much together. And we've certainly seen a lot through the tears. We've been scattered, battered, and tattered, but today we're re-knit by a creative and loving God, a God who loved us so much that he entered into our world to save us. So have hope. Have hope these 3 years after the beginning of the pandemic. Have hope that we have a God who leads us into new life, a God who walks with us through the valley of the shadow of death, a God who gets his hands dirty and isn't afraid to call something new into being, even through death on the cross. None of this is easy, yet with God, it's not only possible, but it is a sure and certain hope, as our scriptures remind us. That hope of resurrection is true. And so as we continue our Lenten journey and we prepare to walk and sing and cry and pray our way to Jerusalem, the cross, and the resurrection, as we face whatever the next 3 years of our lives will bring us, I offer this encouragement from the late and great Phillips Brooks. It's a call for Christian people to be people of hope. He says this: do not pray for easy lives. Pray to be stronger people. Do not pray for tasks equal to your powers, but for powers equal to your tasks. Then the doing of your work shall be not a miracle, but you shall be a miracle. Every day you shall wonder at yourself, at the riches of life which has come to you by the grace of God. Friends, as I look out here today, and yes, even through the camera to those joining us online, I see miracles, each and every one of them. So keep the faith, say your prayers, and trust in the Lord our shepherd. He will, has, and will always lead us to new life. Thanks be to God.